In 1859, the American South lived on fear, but not the kind history books usually talk about. This fear crept through plantation roads at night. It whispered through slave quarters, and it haunted overseers who believed power made them untouchable. They called him a healer, a man who mended broken bones, eased fevers, and kept slaves alive just long enough to keep working. But when bodies began turning up, mutilated, silent, and carefully marked, the South realized something chilling. The man who knew how to heal also knew exactly how to destroy. And when hunters were sent to track him down, he vanished. No body, no trial, no name in the records, only fear. This is the story of the slave healer, whose revenge terrified the South in 1859, and why no one ever caught him. Before we continue, if you enjoy dark history, forgotten stories, and real events that sound like nightmares, subscribe to the channel. It helps keep these stories alive. And comment below, where are you watching from? By 1859, the American South was a place where violence was not hidden in shadows, but woven directly into daily life. Slavery had matured into a fully optimized system of control, engineered to extract labor while crushing resistance at its roots. Plantations functioned like small authoritarian states, ruled by owners who rarely dirtied their hands and overseers who enforced discipline with brutal efficiency. Laws protected property, not people, and enslaved men and women existed in a legal void where suffering was routine and accountability was non-existent. Overseers were the visible face of that cruelty. They decided who ate, who rested, who was punished, and who survived the week. Whippings were carried out in daylight to serve as warnings. Mutilation was not uncommon, and death was often written off as exhaustion or illness. Fear was cultivated deliberately, because fear was cheaper than chains. The sound of boots approaching could freeze entire fields, and silence itself became a survival skill learned early. For enslaved people, pain was constant but unevenly distributed, delivered strategically to remind everyone of their place. Families were torn apart without notice. Children grew up watching parents beaten for slowing down. Injury was not an exception, but an expected outcome of labor, and sickness was treated only insofar as it preserved productivity. Survival depended on obedience, invisibility, and the ability to endure without complaint. The legal system reinforced this reality with ruthless clarity. Courts rarely acknowledged violence against slaves as a crime unless property was damaged beyond repair. Testimony from enslaved people carried no weight, while accusations against them required little evidence. This imbalance created an environment where cruelty flourished without restraint, and where overseers learned that power came without consequences. Every unchecked act of violence further normalized the idea that domination was natural and permanent. Plantations were isolated worlds, separated by miles of fields, forests, and swamps, allowing abuses to remain contained and unchallenged. News traveled slowly, mostly through whispers passed at night or during brief moments of rest. This isolation amplified fear because each plantation believed itself alone, and resistance seemed impossible without allies or witnesses. Yet that same isolation also allowed stories to grow, mutate, and spread in secrecy. Religion and tradition were often used to justify this system, framing suffering as destiny and obedience as virtue. Sermons preached submission while overseers enforced it with iron tools and fists. Any challenge to this order was labeled dangerous, sinful, or insane. Enslaved people were denied education because knowledge itself was seen as a threat, something that could fracture the illusion of control and inspire defiance. By 1859, the South was not merely violent but complacent in its violence. The system believed itself invincible, convinced that terror had extinguished the possibility of retaliation. Overseers walked confidently, assuming fear had done its job and resistance had been bred out of existence. It was in this environment of absolute control, routine brutality, and unchecked arrogance that something began to shift, unnoticed at first, beneath the surface of enforced silence. On plantations, the healer occupied a strange and dangerous position, neither fully enslaved to the fields nor trusted as an equal. He was permitted to move when others could not, called upon in moments of crisis when productivity faltered or death threatened valuable property. His hands were allowed to touch wounds, reset bones, and prepare herbal remedies, yet those same hands were watched constantly. Every step he took carried suspicion, because knowledge in a system built on ignorance was a quiet form of power. Slave healers often learned through fragments, stolen moments, and oral tradition passed down across generations. They memorized plants, roots, and poultices, understanding which stopped bleeding and which eased pain. They learned how long a body could endure before failing, how infection spread, how organs reacted to trauma. This education was never formal, but it was precise, earned through repetition and suffering. What overseers saw as folk medicine was in reality an intimate map of the human body. Because of this knowledge, the healer was both essential and expendable. Overseers depended on him to return injured slaves to the fields quickly, to minimize losses without involving doctors who charged money. At the same time, they feared what he might know, what he might pass along, or what he might conceal. Healers were often threatened more than others, reminded that their privileges could be revoked instantly, that a single accusation could end their lives. Within the slave quarters, the healer carried a different weight. He was sought out in whispers, trusted with pain that could not be spoken aloud. He saw scars that told stories of punishment, broken ribs from beatings, infected wounds left untreated as lessons. He heard confessions, grief, and rage. The healer became a witness to everything the system tried to normalize, absorbing the collective suffering of the people around him without the ability to stop it. This access created a dual existence. By day, the healer worked under the watchful eyes of overseers, performing obedience and restraint. By night, he moved among his people, offering what relief he could, sometimes only comfort, sometimes silence. He knew which injuries were accidental and which were deliberate. He learned patterns in the violence, the habits of overseers, the timing of patrols, and the weaknesses hidden beneath authority. Despite his usefulness, the healer was not protected. He could be beaten like anyone else, punished for failure, blamed when someone died. If an overseer suspected sabotage or disobedience, the healer's knowledge became a liability rather than a shield. This constant tension sharpened awareness, forcing the healer to calculate every word, every movement, every remedy given or withheld. Over time, this role reshaped the healer's understanding of power. He saw how fragile the human body was, how quickly strength collapsed under the right pressure. He understood that violence did not have to be loud to be effective, that control often came from precision rather than force. Living between trust and terror, necessity and suspicion, the healer existed in a narrow space where survival depended on knowing more than anyone else and revealing almost nothing. No record marks the exact moment when endurance turned into resolve, but life on a plantation ensured that such moments were inevitable. Violence accumulated slowly, not as isolated events, but as a continuous pressure that wore down restraint. The healer had witnessed countless punishments, patched bodies that were sent back to work too soon, and buried people whose deaths were explained away as weakness. Each act of cruelty demanded silence, and silence demanded a cost that grew heavier with time. What finally shifted was not a single beating witnessed from afar, but something deeply personal, something that cut through the careful distance the healer had learned to maintain. It may have been the public punishment of someone close, carried out with deliberate excess to make an example. The kind of punishment meant not just to hurt the body, but to erase dignity and identity in front of watching eyes. For the healer, this was no longer another wound to treat, but proof that survival alone was no longer enough. After that moment, the healer's work changed in subtle ways. His movements became slower, more deliberate. He paid closer attention to the aftermath of violence, to how bodies failed and how pain progressed when left untreated. He listened more carefully to the rhythms of the plantation, the routines of overseers, the timing of patrols, the gaps where no one was watching. What had once been knowledge for preservation began to reorganize itself into something colder and more focused. The healer understood that the system relied on predictability. Overseers believed fear had made everyone compliant, that punishment had erased the will to retaliate. This belief created arrogance, and arrogance created vulnerability. The healer saw how men who inflicted suffering grew careless, how they assumed their authority protected them from consequences. He recognized that power was loud, but its defenses were often thin. At the same time, the healer's internal conflict deepened. Every act of healing now carried an added weight. Restoring a body meant sending it back into the machinery that caused the damage in the first place. Each successful remedy felt like complicity, an extension of the system's lifespan. The line between mercy and participation blurred, and the healer began to question whether preserving life without changing its conditions was an act of kindness or surrender. The environment itself reinforced this transformation. Night brought a different plantation, quieter and less controlled. where shadows concealed movement and sound carried farther than expected. The healer noticed how darkness altered behavior, how fear shifted when authority could no longer rely on visibility. The land, once a prison, revealed paths of escape and concealment to those who learned its contours. What emerged was not rage in its raw form, but a disciplined resolve shaped by years of observation and restraint. The healer did not abandon caution or succumb to impulsive violence. Instead, he allowed the accumulated knowledge of suffering, anatomy, and human behavior to settle into a single understanding. The system that had demanded endless endurance had also provided him with everything he needed to challenge it. The first discovery came at dawn, when the plantation was still wrapped in the false calm that followed nightfall. An overseer who had been seen the evening before, confident and loud, was found where he should not have been, his body positioned with an unsettling deliberateness. There were no signs of a struggle in the surrounding ground, no scattered tools, no frantic footprints. Whatever had happened was controlled, intentional, and executed without haste. Those who saw the body understood immediately that this was not random violence. The injuries were not the kind inflicted in anger or desperation. They were precise, targeted in ways that suggested intimate knowledge of how pain traveled through the body and how life could be extinguished without chaos. The overseer had not been robbed, nor stripped of symbols of authority. His power had been left intact, rendered meaningless only by death itself. Word spread quickly, not through official channels but through glances, hushed conversations, and the sudden tightening of behavior. Overseers spoke less and watched more. Guards lingered longer near doorways. Slaves noticed the change immediately, sensing a shift that could not yet be named. Fear, which had always flowed in one direction, began to circulate unevenly, settling into places it had never occupied before. The manner of the killing carried a message that required no explanation. It suggested intention rather than impulse, knowledge rather than chance. This was not an act meant to provoke open rebellion or inspire chaos. It was a warning delivered in silence, forcing those in power to imagine vulnerability for the first time. The lack of witnesses made it worse, because it meant the act could be repeated without detection. As days passed, the details became distorted, growing darker with each retelling. Some claimed the injuries showed restraint, others insisted they revealed cruelty beyond comprehension. What mattered was not accuracy, but impact. The uncertainty fed anxiety, and anxiety eroded confidence. Overseers began avoiding isolation, refusing to travel alone, questioning routines they had followed for years without thought. When a second body was found, the fear hardened into something sharper. The pattern was undeniable now. This was not coincidence, and it was not an isolated act. The killings shared a similarity that pointed unmistakably to someone who understood anatomy, someone who chose methods designed to instill dread rather than shock. The absence of noise, witnesses, or pursuit transformed each death into a psychological weapon. Within the slave quarters, reactions were cautious, but charged. No celebrations, no open approval, only quiet recognition. The healer's name was not spoken aloud, but understanding moved through the community without words. For the first time, the overseer's violence felt answerable to something beyond law or ownership, and that realization altered the emotional balance of the plantation. Each discovery tightened the atmosphere further. Nights grew heavier, filled with imagined sounds and half-seen movements. Overseers who had once enforced terror now lived within it, replaying the scenes in their minds. Aware that whatever force was at work operated with patience and intent, striking not to destroy the system all at once, but to remind it of its own fragility. As news traveled beyond a single plantation, fear stopped being contained and began to migrate. Stories crossed dirt roads and river paths, carried by traders, patrols, and whispered conversations at markets. Each retelling sharpened the edges, adding detail where none existed and certainty where there was none. What had begun as an isolated shock turned into a shared anxiety, binding distant plantations together through dread rather than authority. Overseers reacted first with denial, then with aggression. Weapons were carried openly, patrols multiplied, moving through fields and quarters long after nightfall. Dogs were trained to respond to unfamiliar scents, and torches cut through the dark in frantic sweeps. Yet these displays of force only emphasized the imbalance they were meant to hide, because none of it produced results. The more visible the defenses became, the clearer it was that something invisible was evading them. Plantation owners responded with orders rather than solutions. Demands for answers flowed downward, while responsibility flowed away. Overseers were pressured to restore control, to project confidence, to suppress rumors that threatened productivity. Public punishments increased, meant to reassert dominance, but they landed differently now. Every act of violence carried the risk of provoking another silent response, and that uncertainty dulled its effectiveness. Within the enslaved population, behavior shifted subtly. Movements became more deliberate, conversations more guarded. There was no open rebellion, no celebration of death, only a heightened awareness that the balance of fear had changed. Slaves who had once avoided eye contact now watched more closely. Silence took on new meaning, no longer just a shield but a shared understanding that something was unfolding beyond overseers' reach. Authorities outside the plantations began to take notice as well. Local militias were alerted and bounty hunters arrived, bringing confidence built on reputation rather than evidence. They searched swamps, questioned slaves, and traced routes that led nowhere. Each failed attempt added to the myth, transforming the unknown figure into something larger than a man, something that seemed to move through the South without leaving a trail. The psychological toll grew heavier with time. Sleep became fractured, filled with imagined footsteps and half-remembered sounds. Overseers avoided isolation, altered routines, and second-guessed instincts that had once guided them without hesitation. Familiar landscapes felt altered, stripped of their predictability. Paths that had been walked for years now seemed exposed, and darkness no longer belonged solely to those without power. As weeks passed, the fear stopped escalating and settled into permanence. It no longer needed new incidents to sustain itself, because memory and anticipation did the work. The South had been forced to confront the idea that domination did not guarantee safety, that knowledge and patience could undermine brute force. In the absence of capture or explanation, the terror became self-sustaining, embedded in daily life, shaping decisions, silencing confidence, and lingering in every shadowed space where certainty had once ruled. The hunt began with confidence, fueled by the belief that every threat could be contained with enough force. Experienced trackers were brought in, men who claimed to read the land as easily as a book. Dogs were unleashed at first light, their handlers certain that scent alone would unravel the mystery. They followed trails through fields and tree lines, only to have them dissolve near water, rocky ground, or dense undergrowth where direction became impossible to determine. What confounded the hunters most was the absence of chaos. There were no panicked escapes, no careless mistakes, no obvious hiding places disturbed in haste. Whoever they pursued moved with intention, understanding when to leave signs and when to erase them completely. Tracks would appear briefly, then vanish as if deliberately surrendered to mislead. The land itself seemed to cooperate, offering countless routes of concealment that only someone deeply familiar with its patterns would know how to use. Interrogations yielded nothing of value. Enslaved people offered answers that were vague, inconsistent, or too carefully neutral to act upon. Some genuinely knew nothing, while others understood exactly how much ignorance to perform. Overseers suspected coordination, but suspicion without proof led nowhere. Every attempt to force information risked provoking the very retaliation they feared, and this hesitation weakened their authority further. The healer's advantage lay not only in knowledge of terrain, but in understanding human behavior. He anticipated how hunters would think, which paths they would prioritize, which assumptions guided their searches. He knew they would expect panic, haste, and error. Instead, he offered patience and calculation. By moving slowly and irregularly, by blending into ordinary routines, he denied them the narrative they needed to frame their pursuit. Rivers became silent allies, carrying scent away and masking direction. Swamps swallowed footprints whole, turning certainty into guesswork. Even familiar roads lost their usefulness because predictability became a liability. The hunters expanded their search radius, spreading thin and exhausting themselves while chasing possibilities rather than evidence. Each day without progress eroded morale, replacing confidence with frustration and quiet doubt. Rumors complicated the hunt further. Conflicting sightings placed the figure miles apart within the same night. Some claimed he traveled alone, others insisted he was aided by unseen networks. Each rumor forced the hunters to divide attention, stretching resources and focus. The lack of a single, stable image made the pursuit feel less like tracking a man and more like chasing an idea that refused to settle. As time passed, the effort lost urgency and gained fatigue. Dogs grew restless, men grew careless, and the land continued to offer nothing solid to hold on to. The healer remained ahead not through speed but through anticipation, existing just beyond reach, shaping the hunt by refusing to be found, allowing the search itself to become another demonstration of how knowledge, restraint, and environment could neutralize overwhelming force. The disappearances did not announce themselves with drama or closure. One night there were patrols, torches, and shouted orders, and then gradually there were fewer questions being asked. Days passed without discoveries, without sightings, without any trace to follow. The land returned to its routines, but the absence felt deliberate, as though something had withdrawn rather than escaped. The silence was not relief. It was uncertainty settling into place. Official attention began to thin, not because answers had been found, but because none could be produced. Reports grew shorter, details repeated themselves, and urgency faded into resignation. Plantation owners pressured overseers to restore order, to resume productivity, to stop feeding fear with unanswered questions. Without a body, without a captured suspect, the matter became inconvenient rather than urgent, something better left unspoken than unresolved. Records from the period reveal gaps where explanation should have been. Names were omitted, incidents summarized vaguely, timelines blurred. The lack of documentation was not accidental. Acknowledging that a single enslaved man had operated beyond control, had instilled fear, and then vanished without consequence threatened the foundation of authority. Silence became the safest option, allowing the system to preserve its image even as its certainty cracked beneath the surface. Speculation filled the void left by facts. Some believed the healer had escaped north, using networks that guided runaways through forests and towns where sympathy outweighed fear. Others claimed he crossed into territories beyond plantation reach, blending into communities where his skills ensured protection. There were whispers of boats taken at night, of trails that led toward borders where pursuit slowed and identities dissolved. More unsettling theories circulated quietly. Some suggested he never left at all, that he dissolved back into the fabric of the enslaved population, indistinguishable once the hunt ended. Without a name officially attached to the acts, suspicion could never settle on one person long enough to matter. Every healer, every quiet figure with knowledge, became both invisible and threatening, a reminder that certainty had been lost. The absence of a trial denied the South its rituals of punishment and closure. There was no public execution to restore order, no confession to reduce fear to narrative. Without these symbols, the story resisted containment. It lingered in memory, reshaped by retelling, growing less precise and more haunting with time. What could not be resolved could not be dismissed. As seasons changed, the events faded from daily conversation, but not from awareness. The healer's vanishing became a reference point, a quiet acknowledgement that not every challenge could be crushed or displayed. The land held its secrets, the records held their silences, and the system moved forward without answers, carrying with it the knowledge that something had slipped beyond reach and left nothing behind to reclaim.